The feather mask tool will give you the ability to adjust the softness of the edge of a mat at a very specific point in time. Actually, any specific point in time. You can create feathers all over mask paths. Now in this project, we're going to create a mask around our soccer ball. And if you grab the current time indicator and scrub through the project, you can see there's a fair amount of motion blur on that ball. So we'll start just by creating a mask around the ball. Press the Q key on your keyboard to grab the shape tool. Keep pressing that Q key until you get to the ellipse tool. Now make sure you have layer 1 selected in the timeline, and then click and drag, holding down Shift as you drag. You can make the mask a little bit larger than the soccer ball, that way we can easily reposition it later. After you've drawn out your mask, go ahead and press V to grab your selection tool. Since all the mask vertices are already selected, I can go ahead and click on one of the vertices and then just reposition the mask. To tighten up the mask around the ball, I'm going to press Command T on the Mac. You can press Control T on Windows. Now if I hold down Shift and the Command key, or Shift and the Control key on Windows, I can snap that path in proportion. And now it's much more tight on the soccer ball. When you're done with that, you can go ahead and press Return to set that transform. Now when you press M on your keyboard, that'll automatically open up the mask to the mask path setting. There we can add a keyframe. Before we start keyframing this, it's important to actually move the mask to the point where there's the most motion blur, because I want to make sure I have enough detail in the mask at that point before I start adding keyframes. Now to make life easier, we should actually be making adjustments to our mask in the layer panel. So let's go to layer 1 and just double click on the name to open the layer panel. If your panel doesn't currently look like this, go down to the lower left corner and make sure you have the mask overlay toggled on so you can actually see the edge of the mask that we'll be creating. My layer panel is set to a magnification of 100%. The reason I did this is so I could see the most fine detail as we continue to step through the project. Now, in order to find the first place to add a keyframe, I'm going to change my magnification to fit up to 100%. Now let's move our current time indicator down a couple frames, and frame 3 is where we have the most blur. I know I can barely see that, but if we click on one of the control handles for our mask, we can reposition, and sure enough, you can see there's a lot of blur there. So roughly place your mask over the center of the ball, and before we add our first keyframe, let's actually feather the mask. If you press G on your keyboard, you can toggle between the pen tool and the mask feather tool. Now, if yours is toggling through a bunch of other tools, you need to check your preferences. There are 2 preferences that we should definitely double check before we start keyframing this. Let's go to After Effects and Preferences and go to the General section. In here, we want to make sure the pen tool toggles between the pen and mask feather tools, and then we need to look at the option just above. Make sure Preserve Constant Vertex and Feather Point Count is selected. Now we can click OK. Now the constant vertex count basically means anytime you go to keyframe a mask, it's only going to keep the same amount of vertices that you had the first time you created that first keyframe. It's going to do the same thing with the feather mask points. That's why I want to make sure we go ahead and draw enough points to create the blur for our ball. Now to quickly create the blur that I think I'm looking for, I'm going to press Command T to transform my mask, and I'll rotate it so I can kind of line up each one of these vertices on the corner, if you will, of the motion blur. Now I'll press Return, and we can go ahead and grab our feather tool by pressing G. Now there are a couple different ways the feather tool works. If I click and drag straight out from the edge of the mask here, you can see I'm creating a feather all the way around the outside edge, and the feather will end on the inside of the mask. You can get very precise and click and drag inside the mask as well to control the fall off from the inside to your mask point, but we don't necessarily need to do that right now. Once you drag a handle out, you can rotate that handle anywhere you want around the mask. It'll go ahead and slide accordingly. Now we can add more detail by adding more than one of these control points. Let's hover over the edge of our mask down here, and we can click and adjust the transition from the really blurry part to this part that's not going to be so blurry. So we can repeat the same function over here. I'll go ahead and click and drag out, and then drag another one to be a little more tight in the scene. Just trying to soften that transition in the edge where it gets really kind of sharp over here. If you click off the mask and you see the points disappear, don't panic. You can just click and drag again. So you just want to kind of have 2 points at each edge, and then that way you can have a little bit more control over the transition like this area. Now, if you want to rotate points around the mask, you can select multiple points by clicking on one and then holding Shift and clicking on another. But if you use your arrow tools, you can use the up and down arrows to move closer to the mask path or further away. If you use your left and right arrows, you can actually rotate around the edge of the mask. So here I can use this to rotate to the proper area, and then I'll just deselect those two, click back on, and just move this one here. So I have that nice transition. If for any reason you decide that you want to go ahead and create one big sweeping feather over a specific joint of your mask, you can hold down the Shift key, and notice I get these 2 plus symbols. That's going to go ahead and let me know that it's going to drag the edge of the mask out between the 2 mask vertices. So that's what I was thinking when I first rotated the mask. We could go ahead and click and drag out just with that one option. But I like the results that we got by clicking around and just controlling that manually, so I left it that way. Let's go ahead and undo. There's one other kind of control you have over the mask feather, and that's a hold adjustment. So if I click on the end of a handle, I can go ahead and right-click and choose Hold. When I choose Hold, it's automatically going to point around the edge of my mask to the next control handle. And then here I can drag out and adjust how much this transitions from one to the next. Now, it does give me a nice hard edge there, so if I were trying to rotoscope out something like the edge of a wall, that would work extraordinarily well. Now, I'm just going to undo to change those last changes. Now, we've covered how to change a hold. We've covered how to move multiple handles for our feather. We've covered how to feather one whole segment. There's one more adjustment that we can do. If I hover over a handle, I can hold down the Option key on the Mac or Alt on Windows. This will adjust the tension around this point. So if you click and drag towards the mask, it'll tighten up the tension, and away from the mask, it'll loosen up the tension. To accentuate this, I'm going to add a feather point straight here in the middle, and I'll just drag it out, way out, so we get this really soft transition. Now we can hold Alt on Windows or Option on the Mac and click and drag to the right to soften the tension and back to the left to tighten up the tension around that point. Now, obviously, you can do this across multiple points to have a really fine adjustment to the tension of that point. Now, you can always right-click back on the point and choose to edit the tension that way. And so we could change the tension back to 0 and it'll just billow right back out again. If you decide you want to delete one of the feather handles, as long as it's selected with that little black dot, you can go ahead and just press delete and it will disappear. Now that we have our basic control handles for how we want this mask to look for this individual frame, we can go ahead and add a keyframe for that one frame. Now to finish this job, we would just want to move one frame at a time, and each time we moved a frame, we could go ahead and, with our selection tool, move the mask and all of its feathered goodness, and now we can move along with the edge of the ball. Now remember, even though we have this mask drawn out, if you decide that you still have too much room around the outside edge, you can press Command T or Control T on Windows to open your transform handles for the mask points. Now I could press Shift and the Command key to go ahead and scale that down. It would be Shift and Control on Windows. That would scale it around the center point. Now when I press Return, I've got a much tighter mask for our blurred ball. So the feathered mask tool gives you all kinds of new control whenever you're trying to create very precise masks. Just remember to check your preferences if you're going to be doing a rotoscoping job over any amount of time.